UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Hey, baby.
Hey, baby.
It was fun having a guest on the show this week who I actually already knew.
Mm-hmm.
I met him when I was producing a film in Cleveland, Ohio in the summer of 2015. And he was one of my favorite people on the set. He was a man who was clearly knowledgeable about all kinds of things. He had an almost professorial tone to him. And I remember once sitting at the lunch table and we were chatting about, I think, the occultic milieu in the 70s or something. And I hadn't lost touch with him, but I hadn't spoken to him a lot until after Talking Weird started. And then I found out that he had a long and fascinating history. He was known back in the 70s as the psychic priest. He actually wrote for Fate magazine and appeared in various articles in tabloids from the National Enquirer and other similar magazines to that. And he'd worked with the Warrens, which I know is something that you found absolutely fascinating.
Yes, I did.
And he had a long history in doing things like stage magic, and he was a practitioner of the silver mind control method, or now I think it's just called the silver method.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we should just jump straight into the interview because I don't think I can do this gentleman justice in the introduction. So I'm looking forward to introducing our audience to Edd Schultz. Jenn and I were chatting before today, and I think one of the things that struck her fancy was, I think you were saying, Jenn, that you were fascinated by the fact in one of those pieces, Ed could read his friends' minds when he was into magic when he was younger.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, at first it was talking about your idol was Houdini, and then it went into the fact that you were able to do magic tricks and read your friends' minds or something like that.
Well, actually, the mind reading that I did then was fake.
Okay.
The fact that I knew how to trick people into thinking that you could read their minds was one of the things that made me skeptical about, psychic phenomena.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, I'm a true believer. I believe in ESP. I have it. I know how to use it. Sometimes used to know how to use it. But I also know how to fake it, which I think in one way at least gives me an advantage because I'm not just, suckered by anybody who looks like they can do it.
Yeah.
Like the amazing Kreskin used to be on television a lot, and he tried to come across as though what he was doing was genuine. But I knew, I would watch him and I would say, oh, I know how to do that. I know how to do that. I bought that for $5 10 years ago.
Oh.
But part of the mystique of being a mentalist or a magician who does mind reading is that you need to make it look believable.
Yeah.
So that there's a question in the minds of the people in the audience. Everybody knows that nobody can pull a rabbit out of a hat, really. But people, think, well, maybe somebody could read my mind. So part of the mystique is that you make it look believable. In fact, I have a story. Can I tell a little story?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what we have you here for. I'm fascinated with all your stories.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, when I was a teenager, as I said, I did magic shows for birthday parties and things like that. And I had a friend in school whose father was a stage hypnotist. And he was also a member of an organization that was called something like Society of Clinical and Research Hypnotists. And he invited me to their annual banquet. He was a magician too. He said, Ed, I want you to perform some mentalism, some mind reading for these people as entertainment. And I said, okay, that, I'd be glad to do that. Especially since I was a teenager and I knew all of these people were going to be adults. I loved performing for adults when I was a kid. So anyway, I went to the dinner. We were having dinner. There was a keynote speaker before me, a doctor. I'll never forget his name, Dr. Abdul Khazar. He was a guest speaker from India. He was a biochemist, and he gave a short presentation about the biochemical reactions in the brain during the hypnotic state. Very scholarly presentation. And then this teenager gets up and does maybe $100 worth of mental magic tricks.
Yeah.
And at the end of the banquet, this Abdul Khazar, this doctor, came up to me and he said, "Young man, you are the greatest psychic I have ever seen in my life." And I thought to myself, egad, I convinced this biochemist that what I was doing was real.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
So that was, it was both flattering and it was scary too. Kind of frightening to think somebody who was this scholarly would be duped
Right.
by a bunch of magic tricks. So there you are. I also did later, many years later, when I was in Connecticut, I did a presentation for the local high school on ESP or trickery. And I did maybe 20 minutes of mind reading magic for the kids. I think it was the seniors or something like that. And then when I finished, I said to them, you know, all of the things that they were I heard all these oohs and ahs and stuff like that as I was supposedly reading people's minds. And then at the end, I said, okay, kids, I want you to know that everything that you've just witnessed has been faked. And you should have heard the reaction.
Oh, wow.
There were boos and all this kind of
Right.
stuff. They were really angry that they had been deceived because they believed it.
Yeah.
So I said, the reason I'm doing this is so that you can be cautious when you see these things on TV and stuff like that, people who claim to be real psychics and claim to be real mediums. Anything like that can be duplicated with trickery.
Yeah.
And part of what inspired me to do that kind of thing was that Houdini, in the latter part of his career, had this tremendous campaign against fake spirit mediums.
Yeah.
Because spiritualism was very, very popular. Seances were very popular in his day. And his mother died, and he had been very attached to her. So he went to a number of mediums to try to talk with her.
Yeah.
And when he did, they would do all these manifestation things and whatever.
Yeah.
And he knew that they were just cheap magic tricks.
Yeah.
So he got really angry at the whole mediumistic profession and went on this big campaign where he would do magic shows in which he would expose the tricks of all these different mediums.
When you were younger and you were interested in magic, Ed, were you also at that stage of your life a believer in psychic phenomenon or also interested in psychic phenomenon when you first started practicing stage magic?
Oh, yes, yes. I was a believer, and I was the kind of person who really wanted to believe. You know, I kept thinking to myself, I read, I think there was a comic book around the time that I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. It was all about ESP and various kinds of paranormal phenomena. And inside, there was a little bit about Dr. J.B. Ryan from Duke University and his work with extrasensory perception. I think he was the person who coined that term, actually. And I was fascinated by that because I thought, well, here's a college professor and he believes this stuff and they're testing for it. And as a magician, I went out and I bought a deck of the famous ESP cards, and I would test myself and I would test my friends, and I had a lot of fun with that. And then, of course, later I learned how to do magic tricks that made it look like I was successful doing these ESP card tests and whatever.
Yeah.
But I was always a believer. Still am.
And you went on later in your life to have a correspondence with J.B. Ryan, I think you mentioned the other day.
That's right. In the mid to late 70s, I was the co-director of an organization called the Foundation for Christian Psychic Research, which was a nonprofit educational organization that was interested in looking at the whole field of the paranormal and giving it an interpretation for people in the church. Because at that time, especially in the 70s, they used to call it the occult explosion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interest in ESP and mediums and ghosts and hauntings and life after death and all that sort of stuff. So there were several of us who were clergy and non-clergy who were interested in interpreting the whole field of psychic research to the church. So as I was involved in that, I had correspondence with J.B. Rhine, particularly since he wrote a paper on parapsychology and religion at one time. And I was in contact with, I don't know if the name Charles Tart rings any bells, but he was a big person in parapsychology somewhere in one of the universities in California at that time. And I think I was even in contact with Russell Targ and what was it? Putoff and Targ. They were two engineers who I think they coined the term remote viewing.
Huh.
Oh.
And they did some experiments with remote viewing way back when.
Huh.
So especially when I was involved with the Foundation for Christian Psychic Research in the 70s, I was very, very active in the paranormal community. That was the time that I began to work with Ed and Lorrain Warren.
That's fascinating.
That is fascinating. I know Jen's probably been itching to talk to you about your Warren connection.
Yeah. So did you only have one investigation that you did with the Warrens, or did you have more than one?
No, I did several. In fact, the very first exorcism that I ever did was with the Warrens.
Okay.
I also worked with them on a number of haunted houses in Connecticut. And they were the ones who kind of convinced me to explore the possibility of becoming an exorcist.
Okay.
I was a parish priest at that time in the Episcopal Church, and I had a lecture series called "The Church and the Occult," and we would explore, different things: the spirituality and parapsychology, spirituality and life after death, and witchcraft, and Satan worship, and all of those things.
Yeah.
And it was during that time that I met the Warrens, because they were lecturing. They were from Connecticut as well, and they were lecturing nearby. And my co-director and I went to see them. Were very interested in what they had to say, and went back to see them after the lecture and introduced ourselves and told them what we were doing. And they said, "Oh, we'd love to hear more about that." So we went to the Warrens' home, and they showed us a number of things and played us tapes of hauntings and poltergeist activity and all this kind of stuff. And we kind of said, "Okay, let's see what we can do to work together." And then very shortly after that, they gave me a call one time and said, "Father, we need an exorcist. Are you available?"
Yeah.
And I had never done an exorcism before, but I had read all kinds of stuff about it. I was really kind of turned on by the movie The Exorcist.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, read up on everything I could about exorcism. And so I said to the Warrens, "Okay, let's see what we can do." And they brought a young woman from New Jersey, to the church where I was working in Connecticut. Said that she was possessed by a number of demons. And they had also, before they actually brought her, they played a tape recording, in the days that people used tape recordings, of an exorcism that they had attempted with her in New Jersey. And of course, there weren't any clergy present at the exorcism. It was just Ed and Lorraine who were trying to do it. And there was all kinds of yelling and screaming and banging, and there were bodyguards there and all that kind of stuff. Real Hollywood stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
And they said to me, "We feel that the exorcism was not effective. Could you, because we're not clergy, so could you, if we brought her here to your church, could you do it?" And I said, "Okay, I will do it." And I had, at that time, now see, the Episcopal Church at that time, and probably even now, didn't have any official exorcists. They didn't really take it all that seriously and said, we will give it too much credence if we say that we have exorcists. So a lot of the materials that I had about exorcism and how to do it, I actually got from the Bishop of Exeter in England, in the UK, because they had official exorcists. So the ritual that I used was not the Roman Catholic ritual. It was the Anglican ritual for exorcism. And the exorcism that we did was, it was in the church, and it was very calm, cool, and collected. My theory was, and has always been, that when you're dealing with something like this, whether they're, quote, demons or spirits or whatever, it's sort of like a bully. A bully only has the power that you give him.
Exactly.
If you're afraid of the bully, well, he's going to have all kinds of power over you. So my feeling was, well, if you're afraid of the devil or if you're afraid of these demons, they're going to have all kinds of power over you. So, of course, there's going to be a big fight and yelling and screaming. But if you have enough confidence in yourself and what you're doing and the powers that are behind you, you don't need to be all scared and excited and that sort of stuff. My impression was, if I remembered correctly from my studies in the scriptures, Jesus didn't yell and scream and fight with demons when he exorcised them. He basically simply said, okay, get out of here.
Yeah.
And they went. So I felt, well, if I'm doing an exorcism, basically I just have to say, in the name of God, in the name of Jesus, get out of here. And they should go.
Yeah.
So that was the approach that I took with this young woman. And they seemed to think it was fine. She was fine after the exorcism that we did there. But then I did get a call from them, I think it was several months later, and they said, something is still going on here. We don't quite understand what's happening. She's still seeing things, and she sees these shapes and shadows and all that kind of stuff. So I actually went to New Jersey with my co-director of the foundation, who was also a trained psychic. He was, for many years, he was an instructor for silver mind control. And the two of us did a little kind of psyching out there. And we both felt that what the situation was that this young woman, Pat, wasn't possessed by demons or spirits, but actually she was perhaps a natural medium. And she didn't realize. And there were spirits around who would come to her basically looking for help. But she wouldn't know, she didn't realize that she could do something like this. So she was just scared to death by these things that were manifesting themselves. So we had a service of Holy Communion at her house. I did a house blessing. And I told her, I said, Pat, whenever you see these spirits or whatever they are again, the next time you see them, you simply say to them, into God's hands I commend your spirit. Now you can leave. And, I followed up a number of months later, and she said everything seemed to be fine, and she did what I told her to do. And she was still occasionally seeing these things, but she was no longer frightened by them. She no longer felt that she was being possessed by these spirits, and that she then was an instrument to help them make the transition into the next life.
Huh.
So there we are.
And you had a background in psychology as well, I think, Ed. And sometimes when we were chatting the other day, I had the impression that you almost brought a therapeutic persona when you were helping people who were perhaps in need of exorcism as well.
Yes. Actually, I have a Master of Theology degree with specialization in psychology and religion. And so that, knowing that often people's religious experience may or may not be, quote, genuine spiritual experience, some of it may be psychological. You start hearing voices, you think they're saints or angels or something like that. Well, maybe they are, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're the pizza that you had the night before that's just not agreeing with you. So that was kind of the approach that I would take, was that, and I have to back up just a little bit. I also have done a lot of study in hypnosis. I learned how to hypnotize people when I was 12 years old.
Wow.
And for a number of years, back when I was actually, Dean, when I first met you, I was a professional hypnotherapist.
Okay.
And so that kind of colored a lot of my thinking too, because the subconscious mind, the vocabulary of the subconscious mind is symbols. It's metaphor. So if there's something boiling around in your subconscious mind that's bothering you, whether it's because of abuse or depression or anxiety or something like that, sometimes what the subconscious mind will do, just like in your dreams, is give it a face, give it a name, give it a body. And in that case, when you're working therapeutically with someone, you need to address the name, the face, the body that their subconscious has given whatever this thing may happen to be. So I felt that often, and this was kind of my assessment from my diagnosis or whatever from the situation, often when people came to me saying I'm possessed by a spirit or something like that, it often was not a spirit like Casper the Friendly Ghost, but rather it was some kind of internal struggle or turmoil that they were going through, to which their subconscious mind was looking at metaphorically and giving a name, a face, a body, a voice, that sort of thing. So what I would do is sort of suspend my disbelief and speak the same metaphorical language that they were speaking in order to help them resolve their difficulties. Just to kind of use, not exactly an example, but a way of kind of explaining it. If you have a child who says, there's a boogeyman in my closet,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm frightened of the boogeyman at night, I can't go to sleep because I know he's going to come out and eat me up.
Right.
If you say to the child, oh, it's just in your imagination, it's just in your mind, go to sleep, that's not going to help at all. The boogeyman is still there, and I know it.
Yeah.
So if you instead say to the child, okay, here's a little spray bottle. This has boogeyman repellent in it.
Mm-hmm.
Before you go to bed at night, we're going to spray this boogeyman repellent all around your closet, and that's going to make them run away. That's going to work. Because, you're kind of not really validating their experience, but sort of. You're giving their experience a certain amount of credibility, and you're using the same kind of metaphors that they're using.
Yeah.
So they believe you then.
Mm-hmm.
Anti-boogeyman spray is going to work. So it works.
As a hypnotherapist, which is something you and I have never talked about, did you ever deal with the type of controversial repressed memories surrounding things like alien abduction or satanic ritual abuse or anything like that?
No. Unfortunately, most of what I did when I was a hypnotherapist was weight loss and fears and phobias and smoking cessation, that sort of thing. I did occasionally work doing sort of what you would call forensic hypnosis. I remember there was one particular case where there was a young man who was in an automobile accident, and he wasn't sure how responsible he was for the accident because he couldn't consciously remember whether or not he put his turn signal on at the appropriate point. So through hypnosis, I helped him sort of re-see the whole event and try to see whether or not he actually did put his turn signal on. Now I have to throw a caveat in there. Again, hypnosis is not something that you can use in court because it's not something that you can really verify empirically, so to speak. I mean, he could simply, his subconscious mind could simply say, well, I don't want to be responsible for not having turned on my turn signal, so I'm going to say that I did. Just because it's something that comes out under hypnosis doesn't mean it's 100% accurate. 100% true or anything like that.
Stemming from that, then, do you have a professional opinion on the veracity of things like alien abduction accounts which are recalled under hypnosis?
Well, again, like a lot of these other things, it's just very difficult to say. I also have a degree in philosophy, and having been a sort of philosopher, there's a part of me that says I need to have some kind of scientific, physical corroboration of this. So for someone simply to say, "Oh, I remember having been abducted by aliens," that's very hard to prove.
Yeah.
If they have these little scars around them in different areas and stuff like that, or they have a piece of the spaceship, there's some kind of physical evidence that can corroborate what they're saying. So then it's a little bit more believable.
I've always been concerned regarding accounts which are essentially primarily or purely recalled under hypnosis, that there's a potential, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, that there's a potential of a hypnotherapist who already has a specific belief system in place regarding something like abduction, potentially leading the patient that is undergoing hypnosis under their care. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that either.
Yes, that very, very much so. I mean, that's one of the reasons that hypnosis is not really something that you would bring into court, because especially with something like forensic hypnosis, which is sort of what we're talking about, as the hypnotist who is working with a person like this, you have to be very careful about what you say so that you're not putting words in their mouths. So the hypnotist, for example, would simply say something like, "Now describe to me what's happening."
Yeah.
That's it. You wouldn't say to the person, "Okay, are there people there?
Yeah.
How tall are they? How short are they?
Right.
How ugly are they? Are they ugly? Do they have buggy eyes?"
Yeah.
You ask them questions like that, and then they're going to say, yes, they do.
Right.
But if you just say, "Tell me what you're seeing," then they'll give you a description of, whatever they recall they were seeing or think that they were seeing. It would be much more accurate. This is true also in abuse cases, where people talk about repressed memories about sexual abuse and things like that. The person who's doing the hypnosis has to be very careful about what they say. Where did he put his head? You don't say things like that.
Yeah.
What happened? What happened next? Tell me what you remember. What happened next? That kind of thing. So you're not feeding them their lines, so to speak.
With such a diverse interest in the psychic world, in performing as a professional magician, and also in your work as an Episcopalian priest, did you find that those things sometimes clashed and you were walking a very thin line balancing, say, any of those together? Because I have a suspicion that members of those different communities, whether they be in the psychic community or in the professional magician community or within the Christian community, might have had problems with you trying to balance all three of those things at a certain period in your life.
Actually, I found the psychic community or the parapsychological community a lot more receptive to what I was doing and interested in than I found from the church. Because, just like in politics, there are liberals and there are conservatives. And those who are very liberal-minded theologically would accept what I was doing. In fact, I had a number of clergy that I knew very well who were into parapsychology and magic and hypnosis and those sorts of things. But the more conservative, evangelical, fundamentalist people, they were so scared of everything being demonic that, I had people praying for me. I would get phone calls sometimes from people who would say, you've forsaken God and you've forsaken your ordination vows because you're trafficking with the devil, just because they read that I did magic tricks. I mean, that was sometimes enough to set them off. But for me to be talking about psychic things and even saying at one point that I was a quote, psychic priest, whoa, gee, this is the devil. This is the stuff of the devil. Mm-hmm. I had a picture in a newspaper one time of me standing in front of an old magician's poster that showed someone levitating a woman. And I got a call from a fundamentalist who said, levitation is of the devil. You're trafficking with the devil. Well, I mean, I know it's smoke and mirrors and wires and things like that.
Yeah.
But so that I did sometimes have to kind of balance stuff pretty precariously, shall we say, when I was doing the two. I remember the other day, excuse me, Dean, when we were talking, I told you about a little story of something that happened to me. When I first started in the ministry, I would occasionally do sermons in which I would use a magic trick as an object lesson to illustrate what I was talking about. And then I decided to stop doing that right away when I was at a weekday communion service. And this was one with the freestanding altar so that the people could see what I was doing. And it was mostly mothers with small children in the congregation. As I was unveiling the chalice, I heard a little girl saying to her mother in a stage whisper, "Mom, Father Schultz is going to do a magic trick now." And I said, no, not to her, but to myself. I said, from now on, I will never do magic wearing a collar. And so I didn't after that, because I didn't want anyone, especially impressionable people, children, and I hate to say it, but children and fundamentalists, to think that one had really anything to do with the other.
Yeah.
So from that point on, I became Zauber the magician, not Father Ed the magician, and used a stage name and never wore a collar doing magic after that.
Do you think that mystical, obvious approach that you took as a priest and as a Christian is something that is perhaps missing from a lot of modern Christianity, that immediate perhaps connection with God or with the other?
Hallelujah. Yes. That was one of the reasons that we started this Foundation for Christian Psychic Research, because I had been, back when I was around the time that I was first ordained, I took the Silva Mind Control course, which is now simply known as the Silva Method, which is basically a course in alpha brainwave training. It's a sort of group hypnosis, self-hypnosis training course that helps you to kind of tap into your own psychic abilities. And as I was listening to the introductory lecture, they were talking about different brainwave frequencies, the alpha level and theta level and all that kind of stuff. I thought to myself, as a new priest, I wonder if when you're in that kind of alpha theta level of consciousness, if you're in that level of consciousness when you're celebrating the sacraments, if that would be any different for you or for the people. And I at that time I knew a little bit about Christian mysticism, but not very much. And I knew a little bit about meditation, but not very much. So that really kind of launched this big quest for me to understand the relationship between all of these different things. And I felt very strongly, still do, that there are a number of different levels of communication. There's physical communication, psychic communication, spiritual communication, and mystical communication. Physical communication is you and me talking to each other. Mm-hmm. We hear each other, we see each other, we smell each other, etc. Sometimes there's a psychic connection where you seem to be able to communicate with each other without the use of the five physical senses. That's psychic communication. Now, if you and I, Dean, for example, want to communicate with each other, well, this is what we're doing right now. We're talking. Mm-hmm. And you hear me and I hear you. We don't see each other at the moment, but at least we hear each other. Now, maybe we could do some psychic things and read each other's minds or whatever. The next step, though, is if the two of us say, well, gee, I wonder about God. If I can communicate with you, I want to communicate with God. Okay, well, first let's try that physical communication. You talk to God, you don't hear anything. You don't see God, you don't smell God. So the conclusion that you have to come to sort of empirically is maybe there isn't any God there. But if you think of it in terms of, okay, if God is a spiritual being, if I try to communicate with God by the means of my physical senses, that's not going to do it. I need to use my psychic senses, my mind to God's mind. I need to read God's mind, and God needs to read my mind. That then becomes spiritual communication. To me, that's prayer and meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Prayer is talking to God. Meditation is listening to God. Because when I pray, or anybody prays, you don't really believe that the sound vibrations that come out of your mouth are going to, be picked up by God's eardrums. But rather, what you have in your mind is going to be heard by God's mind. So to me, that's spiritual communication. That's the level on which you need to communicate with God. So the more you are aware of your own ability to use psychic communication with other human beings, the more you then perhaps can become attuned with using spiritual communication to talk with God. So when in my own private prayer life, I would go into a sort of self-hypnotic alpha state and use a lot of mental imagery and things like that in my communication with God, in my prayers. So I would talk to Jesus. I would see Jesus in my own imagination. And that made my whole experience much more real for me. Now, interestingly enough, at the same time that I was going through this, there was a big, I don't know if you're familiar with the charismatic movement from years ago, speaking in tongues and all of this sort of stuff, being slain in the spirit. Well, that was very popular at the same time. And that led me to the conclusion that one of the things that was missing in the church then, and I'm sure still now, is the experiential level of the spiritual things. I mean, sure, we can all meet as a church group, and we can have coffee together, and we can go out and we can save the world, and we can help the poor and all that sort of stuff. But that's not all the church is about. The church is about spiritual dimensions. The church is about building a relationship with God. Well, how do you do that? You do it by tapping into these psychic, spiritual dimensions. And I think we're missing that today. We don't talk that much about Christian mysticism. And I think that's why a lot of people hopped on the charismatic bandwagon, so to speak, because when people were being slain in the spirit and speaking tongues, these are subconscious things that they're doing. This is subconscious communication, not just physical communication. If you're speaking in tongues and you're talking in ancient language, where the heck did you get that? You didn't get it consciously. You didn't read a book. You didn't try Babel or Rosetta Stone to learn Sanskrit. If you're talking in that kind of language now, or Aramaic, well, it's because you've tapped into a different dimension of your own consciousness, that spiritual dimension, that mystical dimension.
Okay.
Because the fourth level of communication, to get back to that for just a moment, there's physical, psychic, spiritual, and mystical. The mystical communication, to me, is a direct experience of God without words and feelings and all that sort of stuff. I was a big fan of William James and his varieties of religious experience.
Oh, it's a wonderful book.
It is. I haven't read it in years, but maybe I should get it out again and read it again. But he talked about the mystical experience as being something that was ineffable. I like to think of there was an old candy bar commercial, I think it was, that used to say, "This candy is indescribably delicious." Well, to me, that's what a mystical experience is. It's indescribably delicious. I cannot tell you and expect you to believe in my mystical experience, because I can't really describe it. It's sort of like being in love. Why are you in love with this particular person? Well, there's something inside of me that says I am. Okay, tell me what it is. Well, I don't know. I can't describe it to you. Well, that's a mystical experience that you're having with another person on a personal level, not necessarily a divine level.
That aspect of the personal mystical experience is something which isn't talked about a whole lot, certainly in mainstream Christianity today, I don't think.
Yeah. One of the things that turned me on to that, too, was in the 1970s, there was an Episcopal priest by the name of Morton Kelsey who was actually teaching, I think he was teaching at Notre Dame, and he wrote a book called The Christian and the Supernatural. And his thesis was that there is a lot of, paranormal stuff. He talked about ESP and psychic things and whatever that really do have roots in the church and in the mystical experience and spiritual experiences and things like that. But a lot of people have, with this age of technology and whatever, brushed those aside because they're not sophisticated enough. Well, how did parapsychology develop? It wasn't just a bunch of people with turbans on their heads who got together and said, hey, this is real. It was scientists who said, those guys with turbans on their heads are doing something real. When I say turbans on your head, I'm talking about swamis and,
Sure.
Back in the vaudeville days, a lot of mind readers, magicians, used to wear these turbans in order to look mystical and mysterious and whatever.
I think they still have those psychic machines where you can put a quarter in and the great Zoltan will tell you your future. I think he's wearing a turban, actually.
Right. Like the one in the Liberty Mutual commercial. I don't know if you've seen that, but
no, I don't think I have seen it.
It's one of those fortune-telling booth things. Anyway, I love talking about. I haven't talked about this kind of thing in a long time, so I really enjoy the experience of talking with you, Dean and Jenn, about this.
Oh, I'm enjoying it too, Ed. It's fascinating.
So I do want to thank the two of you for giving me the opportunity to ramble on about the good old days, so to speak.
I think a lot of this period has been probably almost forgotten. I mean, I know aspects of it, but you were telling me things the other day on the phone. For example, the fact that there were multiple clergymen practicing stage magic as part of their sermon back in the 70s. I mean, I'd never ever heard that before. And to be honest, until I obviously have known you for a number of years, but I didn't know you were the psychic priest. I didn't know that you were involved with the Warrens. I didn't know any of these things. So.
Right. Well, it's one of those things, too, I think that you don't always talk about to begin with. It's the kind of thing, somebody I once read somewhere or heard somewhere that somebody said, talking about your religious faith with another person is sort of like taking your clothes off in front of them, because you're really kind of revealing yourself in ways that people don't normally see you. So for most of my everyday life, I don't hear people talking about the paranormal and that sort of thing and exorcists. And, I don't go around saying to people, hey, I used to be an exorcist.
Yeah.
Right.
That could scare people, for one thing.
Yeah.
And it could also, I've always been very careful to try to not trigger responses in other people by, saying things or whatever that might do that.
Yeah.
Right? It sounds terribly politically correct. This whole idea of triggering. Oh, I don't want to. All these college students. So don't say this, don't say that. They're going to trigger things. It's crazy. But there is a certain amount of truth to it. Because if I went around with a name tag that said I'm Edd Schultz, former exorcist, can you imagine how people would respond to something like that?
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of times while we were chatting about the silver mind control of the silver method, as well as you said you knew some pioneers of remote viewing. And my limited understanding of the silver method is that has a component of a remote viewing type technique in it as well. So have you practiced that type of remote viewing yourself, or looking at things in another location to where you are? Or
Yes, actually. I haven't done it in a long time, but during my heyday back in the 70s, I was interviewed by the National Enquirer at least twice, I think, and I was in another one of these tabloid magazines too, the Globe, I think it was. And as a result of that, there were a number of radio stations around the country and in Canada that would sometimes call me for talk shows, kind of like yours, and say, "Oh, we read about you, and we read that you're the psychic priest. Can we interview you?" And I would say, "Oh, sure, sure." And I remember in one of them, we were talking about remote viewing, and the host said to me, and this is not something I'm suggesting we do tonight, but the host said to me, "Okay, can we try this?" And I said, "All right, I don't make any guarantees," but he said, "Okay, I'm going to look at something in the room here, and I want you to try to pick it up mentally." And I said, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." So he said, "Okay, I'm focusing my attention on something." And I went into, as they say in the silver mind control circles, I went into my level, my alpha level, and imagined, I said to myself, pretty much, I want to see what this man sees. And I just kind of got some impressions of shapes and sizes and that sort of thing. And I began to describe what I saw. My immediate impression was that I saw a horse. And I said, I see something like a fence or, some kind of wooden slat. And I heard this gasp from the host. And he said, "I have to go to a commercial right now." And we went to a commercial. And while we were off the air, he said to me, "Father Ed, I don't believe it. I am looking directly at a picture of a horse. And,
wow.
And the wall behind it is a sort of lattice work wooden thing."
Mm-hmm.
And I said,
Good night.
"Boy, that's pretty cool." So, and I would also, sometimes in the youth group that I had at my church, I would just kind of for fun, because we would talk with the youth group about some of these kind of things. I used to teach them meditation. And I would occasionally say, "Okay, I want you to think of a place that you've been that was either very exciting or very personal to you or something like that." And they would close their eyes, and I would concentrate on one particular kid or another. And I was able to pretty well describe the place that they were thinking of. So that kind of, and that has its roots. To get back to silver mind control, when you're taking the course, or at least when you did back in the 70s, in the final session, you would do something that they called working a case, which is very much like, I don't know if the name Edgar Cayce rings any bells.
Absolutely.
Okay. You sort of did a little Edgar Cayce thing. You would be in small groups, and let's say another member of the group would have a 3x5 note card on which they would write the name, age, and location of someone that they knew who was either sick or injured. And you would go to your level, your sort of self-hypnotic alpha level, and the other person would say, "Okay, John Smith, age 45, Boise, Idaho." And then you would imagine that you're in a laboratory and that there was a body on a table, and you're scanning the body and you're picking up different areas where there was some kind of difficulty. Well, the first time that I was doing this, they gave me the name, age, and location of a man who was like in his 40s or something. And as soon as I got that information, and this is totally the truth, the muscles in my legs began to twitch. And they began to almost violently twitch. And I said, "There is something wrong with this guy's legs. And I don't know exactly what it is, but I see a set of stairs, and my legs are really going crazy here." And the person on the other end who had the card said, "This is my uncle. He's a repairman, He repairs escalators. And he had his legs caught in an escalator as he was repairing it.
Gosh.
So, that really made me a true believer. I said, okay, we do all have a certain amount of psychic ability, and it's just a matter of learning how to tap into it and learning to have confidence in it and belief in it.
Yeah.
So that's what it did. As I said, I'm a believer because of my own experience, not just because of hearing other people's experience. And when we did those, usually you would, at the end of the course, you would work 4 or 5 cases in your group. And I was 80 to 90% accurate when I would do these things. So I went out of there a true believer. And from a spiritual perspective, too, I felt, God has given us this brain, this mind that can do all sorts of fantastic things. I mean, if you just think of something simple like dreaming, everybody every night has these 3-dimensional Technicolor sense around movies in their head with characters and places that maybe you don't even recognize. I fly in my dreams a lot. Wow. That's no CGI there. I know what it feels like to fly.
They're my favorite dreams, the flying ones.
Yeah. So, if all of this stuff is real, or this is God-given, dreams aren't necessarily real, but this is, again, that metaphorical language that the subconscious mind uses. There's something here. Why would God have given us all of this ability to do all these pictures in our head and stuff like that if there weren't a reason for it?
Yeah. Another
way to use it. But unfortunately, some branches of the church say, oh, that's demonic. That's of the devil.
Yeah.
Because Jesus' name is not in there. Well, Jesus' name is not in medicine. Okay? When they discovered penicillin, they didn't discover penicillin in Jesus' name. They just discovered penicillin because that was something that God made in the universe. And we use penicillin today, but we don't use it in Jesus' name. That doesn't make it demonic.
Yeah.
Because some scientists discovered something. They're simply discovering part of God's universe that they hadn't discovered before and learning how to use it. Same thing with the psychic ability, as far as I'm concerned.
Is it still something that you apply or that you use often today, Ed?
Not as much as I used to. Because of various changes in my life, things that I'm doing and whatever, I'm not as involved in that whole world anymore. I'm retired and I'm no longer a priest. So I don't, I'm not in that milieu anymore. I often think to myself, gee, I should get back to doing that again because it really helped me feel much more engaged in what I was doing. I always felt that when I was administering the sacraments, that in a very real way, I was a conduit for grace. And that was kind of how I pictured it, kind of grace coming down from heaven through me, out of me into other people. And that was my role as a priest. Not that other people couldn't do it, but other people weren't necessarily trained to do it. I mean, I wasn't trained to do it as a priest. But I think everybody could be trained to do it. The church teaches you how to pray. Okay, that's fine. But when you tap into this psychic dimension, I feel at least, there's another dimension to healing. Because part of what was involved in the Silva method that I really liked, especially as a priest, was, they said, okay, you can project your intelligence to another point or place in space and become aware of information there. Why? Simply to be able to do that? No. But so that you can then also, if you become aware of, let's say, sickness in somebody, one of the reasons you become aware that there is sickness in somebody is because you can do something about it. You can project energy psychically to that person to help correct whatever may be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So that, to me, is what healing prayer is about. It's about channeling God's energy through you to somebody else to effect some kind of change.
So, talking about other dimensions, have you ever experienced anything like evil or anything? Has anything approached you?
Okay. I did have one experience, and again, this was in the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and I've since heard, read, etc., that there's a possible physical, psychic reason for this. But anyway, I was asleep. We had our first child.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was probably just a few months old or something like that. And I was asleep. He woke up and started crying. My wife woke up and she tried to wake me up so that I could go and help her. And I wouldn't wake up. She couldn't get me to wake up. And I started to wake up, but as I did, I could physically feel something pressing on my chest, like I couldn't get up. And I tried to talk, and I couldn't talk.
Yeah.
I just came out with these kind of kind of things.
Yeah.
Gosh.
And we found out later, after a little while, I was okay. But we found out later that the house that we lived in at the time had actually been a barn many years ago, and that a man had hung himself in the barn right around the area of the top of our steps.
Goodness.
So I don't know, I don't know whether this was some kind of negative spiritual force, or maybe it was just one of the things I've heard about recently is sleep paralysis. During certain stages of sleep, during REM stages and things like that, our body is paralyzed.
Mm-hmm.
If it weren't paralyzed, then when we're flying, we jump out of bed.
Right. Yeah.
Or the boogeyman's chasing us, we'd get up and we'd run away.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's part of what happens in sleepwalking. The sleep paralysis is not working. There's a little bit of a glitch in the system.
Yeah.
So it may have been that, or it may have been some kind of malevolent something that was there. I don't know. We didn't stay in that apartment for very long.
I don't blame you.
Did you ever do blessings on your home after you would help out with exorcisms or anything like that? That way you would be safe?
That I didn't do. I did with this incident that I was just talking about. The very next morning, I blessed the house.
Okay.
And it never happened again.
That's good.
So I don't know. But I've always, getting back to kind of this therapeutic, psychological, theological mix here.
Mm-hmm.
I've always felt in terms of, wanting to be protected from evil forces or whatever, that I'm not sure how much you need to do to protect yourself from them if you have the right mindset in the first place. It's kind of like right now, they talk about social distancing, and they say if you do social distancing, you don't need a mask.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm not, the mask is kind of like the blessing. Do you really need it? I don't know, but I don't want to take any chances, so I'm going to put a mask on. But if I stay 6 feet, 10 feet away, okay, that's that's really what you need to do to be safe. But if you want to be sure that you're safer, wear a mask.
Right. Yeah.
So it's okay to do it, but it may not be necessary, and it may scare the bejeebers out of other people.
Yeah.
Because you hear one of the things you hear now is that the only time you really need a mask is when you might infect somebody else.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if I see someone walking up to me with a mask, I might think, "Oh, gee, they're sick. They've got it.
Mm-hmm.
I better run away." Right. Maybe they don't have it, and they just want to protect me, or they want to be protected from me. So none of it. I think the thing that's fascinated me is none of it is just cut and dried.
Mm-mm.
There's no 1 + 1 = 2 in the paranormal world. It's usually 1 + 1 = 17 or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, it's what's real, what isn't real. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the fascination, because you don't know for sure.
Right. Yeah.
It's not strict science.
Well, I think there's almost this part of us that wants there to be the mystery still out there, and it likes the fact that it isn't 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, part of my thinking this comes from the fact that I was a magician.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I was a magician, I would say, "Here is a top hat. Look, it's empty." Now, everybody out there thinks it's empty. As a magician, I know it's not empty. I know there's a rabbit that's stuck in there behind a black cloth or something like that. But part of my job is to make them think that illusion is reality.
It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and we're probably drawing to the end now. But what I'd love to do, we should have you back sometime. And you know, it would be so much fun if you were up to it, to try to do some of those remote viewing come psychic projection things you talked about doing on that other show, like maybe seeing something that Jen was holding in her hand or that I was looking at where I am or something. If you were interested in doing that, that would make for a really fun show.
Sure, I would be game. I just need to. One of the reasons I said before, that's not something I wanted to do tonight, is because just like physical exercise, you need to exercise your mind, your brain, your subconscious mind in order to do something like that. So if I knew that you were going to have me on, let's say the 1st of July, then probably the 1st of June, I would begin doing meditation and self-hypnosis again to get my mental muscles, my psychic muscles back in shape.
Oh, I would love that if you would be up for it. That would be fantastic.
Sure. I mean, I figure, what do we have to lose?
Thank you so much for coming on the show, though, Ed. You were a wonderful guest.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
We'll have you back soon. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Jen.
That was a very intriguing conversation. I loved hearing about Ed's experiences in the 1970s, and especially his time working with Ed and Lorrain Warren. I cannot wait to have him back on the show for our remote viewing experiment. You can find Ed's official page on Facebook by searching for Edward L. Schultz. Smorgasbord Word, a collection of Ed's writings, is available on Amazon.com. As always, you can find us at TalkingWeird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook at Talking Weird Podcast. To make sure that you never miss an episode, you can subscribe to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms as well as YouTube. We will be back next week with another fascinating guest. Until then, stay safe and keep it weird.